I hope that we could start just with like an introduction to yourself and your work, your music. And I'm especially interested in um, how you were introduced to the Baroque guitar and other kind of the real professional performance of these historical kind of styles, these
Mhm.
period works on guitar. I'm just interested how you got started in that.
Okay. Um, yeah, I'll just start by saying my name. My name is Noé García Jacinto, and I was born in Mexico, and I moved to the U.S. when I was very little, around 7 years old, and um, I've been playing guitar since I was about 13, 14, and yeah, I've made it my goal to kind of. At first, it was just for fun, obviously, and then it became a little more serious, and
Right.
um, now I guess my hope is to become a professor and and have these instruments kind of be part of the curriculum, or the Baroque guitar, which is not mainly part of kind of like a classical guitar curriculum.
Right.
So I guess education wise, since I'm currently at UNT, which is University of North Texas, and I'm doing a doctoral in musical arts. So so that's kind of like my what I want to do eventually is to hold a full time position. So just an advocate of classical guitar, Spanish guitar, and very much so the Baroque guitar.
Right. I think I think the kind of music that I have at least seen on your socials and things um, uh, that are brought into your own repertoire, I think they're really cool because they're a lot of it, especially the Baroque guitar, for us classical guitarists, a lot of our earliest repertoire comes from Soar and Giuliani, maybe those kind of late classical, kind of the romantic. So that
Right.
I really appreciate the stuff that you're bringing to light in your music, that just those older things. So I'm wondering, could you give me some examples of some of the kinds of repertoires, composers, things that you would like or that you think should be more incorporated more into your standard collegiate classical guitar program? Maybe some things that you think are lacking in, at least in your experience.
Are you play classical guitar as well?
I do.
That's great. That's great. It's good to hear. That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm a really big advocate of music from Latin America. So
Hmm.
I always, I mean, as a classical guitarist, I feel like um, we're kind of it's a weird world because when we go into these music classes and whenever we study, it's mainly like Mozart and Beethoven and stuff. And then when you really think about who was around at that time, classical guitar wise, you would say, yeah, Giuliani, Soar, all these people, right? They're kind of the contemporaries. But I just also made it. It's not that I don't want to put input those into our curriculum. I just think that there are many other composers that were not played, right, or not being represented in the classical guitar world. Um, and I like myself. I push a lot towards Latin American composers. Even when I give anybody studies, like
Hmm.
prescribed studies, etudes, pedagogic works, or anything that's going to help somebody grow, I tend to get away from your basic stuff like Giuliani arpeggios,
Hmm.
your Carulli stuff, basically stuff that's always prescribed since the beginning of classical guitar. So that's what I do mainly is I try to in if I was to have a full time position curriculum, I would like to just have just more works from around the world, mainly Latin America, because I do come from Mexico and I feel connected and I feel like a lot of the rhythms are also very helpful. So yeah, I just kind of make it a goal to, like you said, just to kind of get away from the your uh, typically prescribed stuff. Some examples would be like prescribing like from Argentina. There's, I mean, not Argentina. I'm sorry. From Mexico, there's Ponce. He wrote a few
Right.
preludes. I also like to
Hmm.
do a lot of studies by Ernesto Cordero, which is he's Puerto Rican and he has a lot of really good rhythmic studies, really cool like Caribbean studies, and they're really they're accessible, meaning they're just as easy as these other Caruli etudes, and
Right.
um, I like to use a lot of Stanley Yates, and a lot of
Hmm.
again, as you probably know, a lot of the technique changes with time, and so I just feel like it's good to kind of change it up, as far as good classical guitar curriculum goes. So I hope I answered your question. So
I think that was great. I was even going to ask if you ever assigned the Ponce Preludes, because those are some of my favorites. I like bringing those out for practice a lot more than the Soar Etudes or anything like that. Um,
yes,
I think that segues great to another one of my questions, which is specifically about the uh, let's let me think about how I can phrase this. I guess the benefits that you find to engaging with all these different kinds of music across different time periods, and of course different cultures as well. Even though focus on Latin America, but even with that, it's such a huge
yes, of course,
spectrum of styles and everything.
exactly.
So I was wondering, how do you see those kind of things interacting, overlapping within your own music? How does the dialogue between going from Baroque guitar to picking up a Ponce sonata, how do those interact within your own playing?
Yeah, good question. I basically, I think that I could just say kind of like how it's helped me in general,
Hmm.
and it was kind of like not something that it was kind of something that have, um, I didn't have an idea how it would help me until I picked it up, and then
Right.
you just kind of filled in the blank. So I mainly started with obviously just classical guitar, and since I started, I was always trying to push away like your regular pieces, like your very standard pieces. I was a very
Hmm.
stubborn classical guitarist. I actually didn't want to do all the basic Spanish stuff. Um, so I did a lot on the modern stuff, and then just kind of like as I started getting into the actual guitar building and just deeper into details, and um, then I started like really enjoying Spanish music again, like just the the recuerdos pieces, the
Hmm.
Alhambra, and all these like Asturias, the pieces that you're like, oh, they're so overplayed, I don't want to deal with them anymore. So I guess it just became kind of digging more into the interest of like who's the guitar builder, what was going on at that time, why did the guitar sound like that, and then you get into those pieces once again. I
Hmm.
actually with Baroque guitar, I got into it because I just thought like, oh, I want to be in an orchestra. That was
Okay.
my initial I guess response to playing the Baroque guitars, because as you know with classical guitar we don't really it's kind of like a lonely instrument. It's you can either collaborate with somebody, but we don't have orchestras right now. They kind of have like guitar ensembles, but we
Guitar
don't have
orchestras, right?
guitar orchestra. But as far as that, we don't have any ensembles, right?
Right.
That we are connected to, or that we always are kind of using that muscle of like ensemble playing.
Right.
So we don't have that. So I just thought like that's a really good thing to for me to get into, is to be in a Baroque orchestra. So I joined
Yeah.
UNT a few years ago. My journey with the Baroque guitar is not as long as some,
Mm.
but I feel that now that I'm deep into it, I'm like, I wish I would have done it a long time ago.
Right.
But that was my initial thought, is okay, I'm gonna join. I know the guitar, I know how to play sort of. Baroque guitar is a little bit
Right.
different. If you have any experience, it's a
I don't.
five
I was going to
fours.
ask if you could give us some basics of the differences in techniques, if you don't mind.
Perfectly. I'll do that shortly, and I'll just finish that thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so I joined without really thinking about you know you too deep into it. I was just like, I really want to be part of an orchestra. I think it'd be good for my development, and I just fell in love with it. It's you quickly kind of find out that the guitar holds a different position in a Baroque orchestra. It's and you kind of learn to read figures, meaning
Oh,
you
okay.
don't really you don't really read chord charts, right, when you're in guitar,
Hmm.
which you know, where for a modern guitarist you see a C, G, D, and you're like, oh, great, you know, I can see those chords. But in Baroque orchestra, you see a bass line, right? And you kind of realize that bass line and say, okay, what is the harmony that's implied, and figure it out on the guitar.
You have to think a little bit more like a harpsichord player, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Figured bass and they call them figures, and so you kind of have to look at the score. And at that time, remember, musicians were not that they're not now, but I feel like musicians in the Baroque era a long time ago were not only performers but composers, and they're very good at ear training. They're very good. You know, it's like the training was so much. I feel just a lot of things got lost as academics continued, and we kind of separated what it was to be a performer or to composer, to, you know, so that was all one thing back in that Baroque era. So it's kind of inspirational to just, you know, to listen to it and to read about it and to be like, wow, these guys, they did everything. But that was my initial ideas, like just being a Baroque orchestra. And then I just started getting deep into it, and you know, how idiosyncratic it was, like to, when you see the tablature, you know, because you think like with guitar, tab is kind of like a lot of people, like as an instructor, you think a lot of people think, well, tab is, if you know what tablature is, it's kind of like a form that only pertains to plucked instruments, right? So a lot of people are like, that's cheating. It tells you gotta learn how to read music, you know?
Right.
In reality, the main thing that helped me is the fact that Baroque guitar is read with tablature, and it's actually very telling, and the composers details really specific things in this tablature that's only pertaining to the guitar, right? So when somebody does modern transcriptions, they do modern notation,
right?
Which, you know, is good. You're like, okay, got it. You know, I know how to read it, but it doesn't tell you where to place your finger, right? It doesn't say whether it's the A on the third string or the A on the fourth string.
Right.
You kind of have to figure it out for yourself. But tablature is very specific, right? So mainly what I've learned just kind of going through this journey is that the Baroque guitar was just very, very specific, and it has been very helpful in kind of filling in the gaps to this modern guitar, classical guitar technique that I felt I understood very well. But this Baroque guitar, just learning how they would strum, learning how they would detail, you know, what is this finger, you know, the index finger, how did they detail it in there? What about our left hand fingerings? Like, we use a system of 1, 2, 3, 4, but they used to use dots, and it's a little bit more tuned, right?
Okay.
So it's, for us, it's yeah, so just kind of filling in the gaps, realizing that, you know, the old Baroque instruments were very idiosyncratic in the idiom, and it was a little bit more specific to what you wanted, right? So there was a lot more detail, which is what I mean to say. There was a lot more detail that I was able to figure out that kind of ties into modern guitar playing. Okay. So that's most helpful. Yeah.
That's really interesting. You hear most often when people talk about the difference between modern notation, Baroque notation, so often so much people will say that the Baroque will have less detail just because it's missing the dynamics and tempos and things, you know, things that, I mean, we assume now people just knew, but that doesn't mean that it's less detailed necessarily. And so, yeah, it's interesting that looking at the other kinds of notation, you see completely opposite observations. Thank you for that.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you. Would you like to describe the Baroque guitar and maybe some of the differences and their consequences for, you know, the sound?
Sure. Yeah. So just in general, talking about the Baroque guitar is you kind of have to think about where it came from and the other different styles of guitar that was around at the time, or different tablature, right? That's what I mean to say mainly. I play mainly the Baroque guitar, the guitarra española. Really, it's mainly towards Spanish idiom, and I like to kind of investigate more of the Spanish composers at the time, like Guerau and Santiago de Murcia, and also Gaspar Sanz.
Right.
But there were a lot of other Baroque guitar composers from Italy. They used a different type of tablature, and Germany as well, and in France. So mainly I'll describe what the Baroque guitar mainly in Spain, and I think it's a little bit more specific to what I'm doing. But so the Baroque guitar has 5 courses. So a course is basically a pair of strings. So in reality, it's 5 courses, but there's 10 strings in total.
Right.
So the Baroque guitar is very small in its size. It's a smaller instrument. It's highly decorated, much like, if you know, like the Baroque area is very highly decorated, as you know, if you go to the big churches and stuff like that. So it does resemble in its artistry kind of like the Baroque era, or what that entails, right? The attention to detail and stuff like that. So again, 5 courses. They're actually in mine, and it's very typical actually for the first string. It's kind of like the modern guitar, where the first string, it's an E string, the second string is B. For anybody out there that will listen, or for yourself if you're a guitarist, but you know, I'll just go through the letter names: E, B, G, D, and A. So it's missing 1 string from our modern guitar. Basically the role of a Baroque guitar is mainly strumming. That's where it comes from, the rasgueados, right? Rasgueo. And that's a lot of strumming, and that's kind of like what the purpose was of the Baroque guitar, rasgueado. And then as time developed, it became more punteado, which means you would start having more lyrical lines, right? More counterpoint and stuff like that. But again, Baroque guitar small, 5 courses. The first string is not doubled. It's the way I have it now is just 1 string, and it's called the chanterelle, which is singing string, and it does come from a French word. Chanterelle is the singing string, which is kind of like the melodic string. So they left it alone so it could kind of come out a little bit better. Alone meaning there's no double string. The tablature is basically like modern classical modern guitar, but it's flipped. So with modern, we have the 6th string that's on top, but and the first string that's no, backwards. I'm sorry.
Right.
With the modern, 6th string is in the bottom, and the high string is on top. With Baroque, it's flipped, right? So it's kind of like if you're looking at it in the mirror, you're like, it's you know, that the low string is on the top, and the high E string is in the bottom.
Okay.
So it's flipped, right? So that's the tricky part, and it's also in this case it's French tablature. I have read a little bit of French tablature. It's done by letter name, so A is like open, B is 1st fret. With this one, it's just numbers. It does share with the modern with modern tablature, with guitar tablature, that it is numbers. But the staff is, or the tab is the other way around, it's flipped.
Right.
So yeah, and again, there are a lot of details when you see that. When you take a look at this music, it does tell you where to trill, or what left hand fingers even on there, what notes are being held as far as campanella, or like letting notes ring over. Like when you hold a chord, you hold it in arpeggio, right? When you hold a chord and you play it as an arpeggio, all the notes are still ringing. So that's also detailed a lot in Baroque guitar, which is kind of very special. So you know how long they wanted you to hold notes. And I think a lot of people basically don't realize how much information, or a lot of classical guitarists, how much information you can gain just by learning how to read a little bit of it, right? Have you learned how to read a Baroque guitar? Has anybody said, hey, this is something?
No, I didn't even know that the tab was flipped. That sounds like it would be incredibly hard to read at first.
Especially if your whole life you're reading tab, or you're teaching kids.
So many guitarists grow up learning that tab, and so many can only read that tab. And so, yeah, that would be crazy. But I imagine that once you're able to flip back and forth between those, it just feels a little bit more powerful, I imagine.
Yes. Yes. And so, just to kind of finish up, yeah, the row in the guitar is very percussive. Baroque guitars, just the row is a little bit more just kind of adding a percussive aspect to the Baroque orchestra, and it of course you can still hear it, but there's something about the gut string and the smallness and the way it reverberates and because it has double string, it just sounds like a little bit more orchestrated, or you just feel it sounds a little fuller,
Right.
Than a modern guitar. So its role was very percussive in the Baroque orchestra, and again, if you're playing solo, it kind of takes on a different form. If you were a solo Baroque guitarist, you strum and you do a little bit of a combination of strumming and also lyrical playing, which is alternating your fingers, kind of leading to modern classical guitar technique.